there guys, so today's video is going to be my favorite neutral palettes with a twist. Now the tones of most of these eyeshadow palettes are neutral, but it has like a pop of color or like a bit of like a touch of interesting shades in them that make them a little bit more unique in my collection. So I got this idea from Karen Harris. I don't know if anyone had done this before. I'm sure people have, but I will leave her video linked below. But I thought that this would be a fun video to do myself, so I wanted to do it too. So we're going to be starting out with Colourpop, and there are 6 palettes that I really would like to talk about. These are also some of my favorite Colourpop palettes in my collection. These are like in my top 15 favorites. If you guys have seen my ranking of my Colourpop palettes this year, I will also direct you to watch that as well. I'm probably not going to put it in the description box. You can just search my channel. So let's start out with the one that I'm actually wearing on my eyes today, and that is the Plush Like Me palette. Now, I have ranted and raved about this palette for a good like year and a half now, ever since I got it added to my collection. And I say this time and time again, but this was such an unexpected favorite for me because I literally had no interest in picking this palette up. I thought it looked boring, and then when I received it free with an order, because I was like, oh, I'll get this and one of the other palettes I'm going to talk about, they became some of my favorite palettes from Colourpop. And the reason why I really love this one, I know that the overall tone of this is neutral. Sorry about the light. Oh my god, I'm really trying not to blind you guys with this one. I'll just hold it right here, but it's just that reflective background. The overall tone is neutral, but we have some pops of green and pops of red and a little bit of an olivey green pop in here that makes the palette a little bit more unique and a little bit more interesting in my collection. And this is one of my favorite neutral palettes from Colourpop because you can go in so many different directions with this palette, and I love that you can just create like more interesting looks with this palette, but also not being too like outside of the box. If you're a person that doesn't really dip your toes into color too often, I think this would be a perfect option for you. I believe this one is still available on the website, and it's a really good basic one. I love that there's a brow bone highlight in here, and I love these deeper tones on the bottom, so I really don't have to go into any other palette when I use this, and it's just such a good palette formula-wise. The shimmers in here are so beautiful and super smooth, and the mattes are just so buttery and easy to blend and pigmented. So I just love this palette. There's not one dud shade in here, and it's just such a good one. So I had to start out with this one because this was like the first one that came to mind besides the other two that are in the same format. They're like my top 3 favorite Colourpop palettes with a twist, like neutral palettes with a twist, palettes in my whole collection. So what I'm wearing on my eyes today is that I'm wearing Slip Dress in the crease because I really love that like yellowy mustard color. Then I darkened up the crease more with the more peachy color, which is called Velour. And I put that here. And then I went in with both of the deeper brown shades on my outer corners. So I used Flannel, and then I darkened it up with Girl Band. And then for the lid shade, I just wanted the lightest shimmer all over the lid, so I went in with Video Night. And then on the lower lash line, I just wanted a pop of that olivey grungy green, so I went in with Depp. I don't even know why that's called Depp. Is that for Johnny Depp because it's literally spelled like his last name? It's probably why. And then I went in with the like more rosy toned gold shade Throwback on my inner corners, and that's what I have on my eyes today. And just everything is really, really pretty, and you can add that pop of like grungy olive green, and it's still like a subtle neutral look, but it makes it a bit more interesting. So this palette's never boring to me. Every time I use it, I always love the looks that come out of it, and it's just such a good palette. So I would highly recommend this to everyone. And again, I love the wallpaper packaging. I love like the velvet elevated design. I wish they would do that more with some of their other palettes, but oh my god, it's just such a good palette. So let's stop raving about that. I have a lot of palettes here, so sometimes I'll stay on one palette for like ever, and then I won't talk about the other ones for as long. So let's hurry it up. My nose is already itching. Okay, so the next Colourpop palette is the In The Springs palette. Now, this one was a very unexpected favorite as well, but I kind of knew I was going to love this, but not as much as I thought I was going to. And this is one of my favorite palettes they've ever done. This was my favorite summer palette last year, and the overall tone of this palette is neutral, but then you have these like pops of blue, and then you have like this more reddish tone, orangey matte, and you have these really beautiful like tangerine kind of shimmer shades and this pop of orange, but you can also do a very tamed down neutral look with this palette as well. So that's why I would consider this a neutral palette with a twist for me. And the shimmers in here are just so blinding and beautiful. And the mattes, again, super creamy, buttery formula and pigmented and just blend together so easily. This one was my most used palette in this summertime last year. I actually did whip this out once this year as well, because usually I mostly use this in the summertime, but I just wanted to use it again like last month, and I still freaking love it. I just wanted to refresh my memory to see if I still loved it, and I really, really do. It's a beautiful palette. So I just wish the only shade I would have swapped out in this palette is this for more of like a poolside blue shade. Like a little, like more so like turquoise blue. But other than that, this palette is beautiful. This neon orange is so good. And this tealy shade and then like these shimmer shades are stunning. I love this Climb Time shade too. It's a really beautiful turquoise, but this palette is so good to do like a neutral orangey eye on the top and then pop the blue on the bottom. Like I used this shade so many times as like a pop of blue. And then I would just pop one of these stunning like inner corner highlights, because this one and this one are light enough for me for that. It was just such a stunning look. So I absolutely love this palette, and this has become like one of my staple Colourpop palettes because it's just, they were coming out with such tired collections last summer, and then when this palette and collection launched, I was like, okay, I'm paying attention now. Like now I want to get some things from Colourpop again, because I just thought that this collection was just so pretty, and people responded to this collection and some of the products sold out. So when they actually put more effort into their collections, people respond to them. So, okay, and then the last 12 pan is the Limoncello. This was the other one that I got free with an order. So I got the Plush Like Me and Limoncello at the same time. And this became one of my most used spring palettes last year. I really haven't used it as much this spring. I did get to dip into it once, but I am 100% going to bring this with me to California. So I do intend to get some more use out of it when I go to California, because I think that this is like the perfect color story. I'm also going to bring the In The Springs palette with me as well. And those are two just like staple palettes that I can bring that I can do multiple looks with, that those are going to be great palettes for me to bring. So obviously this palette again is mostly neutral. Without the pop of blue and the pop of yellow and green, it is mostly a neutral palette. But the reason why this palette is so good is because of those pops of color. And again, this is one of like my favorite palettes to use to do like a neutral eye on the top and then pop the blue on the bottom. And it was just so pretty. This blue shade is one of the best that they've ever done. Again, not one dud shade in here. The shimmers in here are so blinding and stunning on the lid. Some of my favorite shimmers ever from them. They're just so reflective and beautiful. And I did get to wear this once, I think last week, and I used the shade Easy Penny all over the lid and just used some of the like neutral shades on the crease. And then I used Touring on the inner corners, and I forgot like just how beautiful this palette is. And I really would like to dip into it a little bit more. I'm not sure if I'm going to have the chance before California because I'm always rotating palettes, but this palette is beautiful. I love the yellowy shades in here. These lemony yellows are so good. And I find that these are the only two you really need. Because I use this shade, and this shade together, and then I just pop either this one or this one on the outer corners, and it's such a pretty look as well. So this one is one of the best neutral palettes with a twist in my collection as well. This one is just so good, and this one was super popular, again, for a reason. They also released it at the time where yellow and blue were very hot colors during that summer. I think it was summer of 2021. And again, a lot of people responded to this collection. This one is a really good palette. Oh, I love it. Okay, and then two 15 panners. They're both collaboration palettes, but I just wanted to give both of these a shout out. This one is no longer available, but this became such an unexpected favorite for me. The formula in this one is one of the best they've ever done, and that is the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer palette. There is something about the mattes and the shimmers in this palette are just so gorgeous on the lids. Like, I was like not expecting to fall in love with this palette as much as I actually did. But the shimmers in here are just so ridiculously stunning. And again, the palette is mostly neutral tone. Like if you take away the pops of green and the two pops of red, you have a neutral palette. But like you have these cooler tones, you have the warmer tones, you have the deeper mattes on the bottom. Like you have a good 5 deepening mattes here. You have a green, you have a dark gray, you have a dark red, you have a dark brown, and you have like a toasty brown. But that's what made this palette a little bit more interesting and special, is that the mattes in here are definitely deeper than what Colourpop usually puts in their palettes. Like these ones are lighter tone, but they're really good mid-tone shades that like these deeper tones would work really well for a multitude of skin tones. And then the shimmers are just so blinding and stunning. Like I, again, was so blown away by them. They just have like that super buttery smooth formula, but they're so metallic. That one is Elf Practice and Misfit Toys. And they just knocked it out of the park with this one. A lot of people loved the Muppets palette as well. But again, this palette sold out when it came out. Most of the collection sold out. And I don't think they ever restocked it. Or maybe they restocked it like once. But I don't just love the palette from this collection. I also love the highlighter and the lipsticks. It was just such a well executed collab. And this is when I feel like they put in more effort in their collab palettes. Now I'm just like, meh, they're alright. You know, like I could do without some of them. But these deep dark mattes are so good. And I find that this is the only green shade that I need in here, because I can use all of these mattes to create depth and then just use this. And it's just so pretty. But like all the matte shades work and all the shimmer shades work. Like I wouldn't remove any of these shades for a different one. I think that this is one of the most perfect color stories I've ever curated. And the formula is just fantastic. The mattes are so good in here too. So I could rave about this palette for forever because it's one of my all-time favorite collab palettes. I'm just not a huge fan of this packaging because it does easily rip. So I'm probably going to have to get rid of that outer sleeve soon. Okay, then my favorite Disney palette is the Midnight Masquerade palette. And I would consider this a neutral palette with a twist as well. But this is also my all-time favorite Disney palette. But again, the overall tone of this palette is mostly neutral. Like if you take away the red, the pink, the blue, and the green, you mostly have a neutral palette. But again, this palette was just so beautifully done. And again, this is when I feel like they put a lot more effort into the Disney palettes as well. And I almost included the Anna palette as well, but that tone, like the overall tone of that palette is neutral. Like it only has like a pop of purple and a pop of pink, but those are still like very tame shadows. And I love that palette, but I would say this one is more so a neutral palette with a twist because you have the pressed glitters, you have like this green shade, and you have like these deeper mattes on the bottom. But the way that they did the tones of these mattes is what makes this palette just so good. And then the shimmers in here, like the different finishes that you get, like Spinning Wheel and Mama Odie are duochrome shimmers, and then you have the pressed glitters, and then you have the regular shimmers. It's just such a brilliantly themed color story that I absolutely love it. And they absolutely nailed the theme of incorporating each princess into just 15 shades. The shades that they did for each princess are just so perfect. Like Esmeralda's shades are why can't I remember? Dulgy and what's the other one? Is it only that one? Well, for Frog and oh my god, Princess and the Toad. Princess and the Frog. Oh my god, Caitlin, words. Mama Odie and Frog and Wife are from that. And then Cinderella, there's just Royal Ball, I'm pretty sure, because they've done more Cinderella shades in the first palette that they did, like in the It's a Princess Thing palette, which that palette is way more neutral tone. But anyway, these are beautiful. I love the deeper tones down here. They are kind of getting a bit crumbly and not as saturated as they used to be over time. But these matte shades are so insane. Look at that red Gaston. Oh my god, that's one of my favorites. And then this gold shade, Mrs. Potts. This is probably my all-time favorite gold shade from Colourpop. It's just such a saturated, shimmery, beautiful gold shade. There's just so many good shades in here, and I could swatch this palette for forever. And I used this a ton when it first came out. And I still go back to it and reach for it when I can, because it's just such a brilliantly themed, beautifully curated color story that I feel like, again, a multitude of skin tones can wear this. And I just love that they added that deeper row of mattes on the bottom and the shimmers in the middle. And then the more mid-toned mattes in the first row. Like, it's kind of similar to the Rudolph palette layout-wise, because there's a lot of deep mattes in the Rudolph palette and just 3 mid-tone mattes, and then the rest are shimmer. So it's actually pretty similar to this one. I just realized that. Like, with the shade ratio, not the color story. Okay, and then the last one from Colourpop is one of my all-time favorite palettes from Colourpop, and that is the Lust for Dusk. This one is mostly neutral, but there's some pops of tones that make this more interesting, and it's just such a stunning palette. I'm going to leave this out to wear it tomorrow because I'm just dying to wear this again. This is one of my favorite palettes that they've ever done. The shimmers in here are unreal. They're so super sparkly and shimmery. And then the mattes, again, are just so easy to work with. I'm so excited to use this palette tomorrow because it is my top 3 favorite palette from Colourpop. This is always number 3 because y'all know I love the So Jaded and I really love the Harry Potter palette. This one's number 3. I was using this palette a ton when I first got it. I still reach for it when I can. I haven't used it in a while, but the last time I used it, I love my look every single time. I almost used it today, but I want to wear it out tomorrow because today, again, I'm not going anywhere. We have the pop of pink, we have the oranges, we have the yellow, and then we have like these interesting cooler tone mattes on the bottom, like this super blue, almost bluish toned gray, and then this purpley brown. It's a stunning, stunning color story. I recommend this palette to everyone because, again, I feel like a multitude of skin tones can wear this. It might not go as deep and dark for really dark skin tones, but I feel like it's good for fair all the way to, like, deep skin tones. Maybe for darker skin tones, I would say, like, the Rudolph palette or some of the other ones I'm going to talk about, but this one is just so stunning. These shimmers are insane. I always swatch Shaken because it's such a gorgeous one. And Quiet Storm is amazing. Night Lovers is a beautiful shimmer as well. And then I'll swatch one of the matte shades, but just incredible. I really wish this was the only collection where I wish they made like a full collection just for the Lust for Dusk palette, because this came out with 2 other 9 pans and then they kind of expanded on the 2 9 pans. They had like an eyeliner and a Super Shock for those, and I think a gloss. I can't even remember, but I know there was an eyeliner and a Super Shock for both of those, but they only came out with the palette for this palette. And I'm like, they could have done, like, such beautiful blushes and, like, a highlighter for this collection. And, like, really shimmery, like, stunning glosses. And I feel like it would have been such a beautiful collection. But at least we got this amazing color story. So I'm definitely putting that next to me to use tomorrow because it's in my spring rotation for my favorite spring palettes right now. Those are the ones I concentrate on because I like grouping my palettes by season now, so that tends to be the easiest way that I can get use out of my palettes. All right, now let's talk about the brands that are not Colourpop. So I'm just gonna go in order that I have them here. So the first one is from Odins Eye, and Odins Eye usually doesn't do that many like neutral palettes, but this one I wanted to include at least one, and this was the only one that, like, really is a neutral palette with a slight twist to it. So this one is overall neutral. So this is the Red Dragon It's Judy Time palette. And this is actually my favorite palette from Odins Eye that they've ever done. This is my favorite one in my entire collection. This is my most used Odins Eye palette. I absolutely love it. It's just one of my favorite warm tone palettes in my entire collection, if not my favorite, because the mattes are so beautiful, but they have like this pop of orange, red, and like this pop of green that just makes it a little bit more interesting. And then the shimmers in here, like this shade Solar Flare is like a greenish gold. And then Luna, I mention Luna every time I talk about this palette, but it's literally my all-time favorite Odins Eye shimmer because it's a multi-chrome and it just shifts red, orange, and green, and I love it so much. I have to swatch it like every single time. You can't really see it on camera, but in person you can see it shift from green to red to bronze, and it's just so stunning. I love that shade so much. But I just wanted to mention this one. And here's the green shade. And then here's the dragon shade. I'm just going to do finger swatches. I'm not going to do like a million swatches on my hand just because I don't want to be here forever swatching. But it's so beautiful. Unfortunately, this collection was only available for a limited amount of time because, you know, Odins Eye can't keep around their collaborations for forever. But when it comes to a palette that I know I can rely on to really be saturated and a formula that I can rely on, I reach for this palette. And also, it's just a pleasure to work with. It is mostly neutral based, but again, the tones of these mattes are just a little bit different than the typical ones you like. All of the undertones of these mattes are unique to my collection. Like, I really don't have any mattes like that are come close to the undertone of these, and they're just beautiful, and the shimmers are so stunning. So I absolutely love this palette as well. Okay, then next up is one of my most recent new brands, and that is... Sorry, I just had to do something really quick. So the next brand is Glaminatrix Cosmetics, and this is the Nearly Natural palette. This has become like probably my most used palette this year because the shimmers in here are so stunning, but I keep on going back to it. One, because I want to get more use out of it, but two, the shimmers are insane in here. And the reason why I would call this a neutral palette with a twist, and also Karen Harris included this one in her video. I don't think she included any of the Colourpop palettes I talked about, but she did talk about this one. I was like, yeah, that one definitely is, because it has like this mustardy green, like grungy green, and then like this pink shade. But pink, for me, pink is a neutral. But mostly the overall tone of this palette is neutral. But I love that we have like this cooler tone matte in here and like these two neutral shades. The only thing I would say is that I wish that there was one more matte in here that was a bit more of like a mid-toned brownish shade. But I do understand the purpose for all of these mattes and all of the shimmers. Like, again, there's not one dud shade in here, and there's not one shade that's like redundant. Like, I get use out of all of these shades. And the shimmers are insane. My two favorite shades are Naked Eye and Nearly Natural, which is the signature shade. These ones are just so insanely sparkly. And I also love the gold and the green. But I like the lighter tone ones. But look how insanely metallic and shiny those are. They're so beautiful. And then here's the green. But the mattes are really good too. They perform really, really nicely. And I've just reached for this palette again and again this year because I just really love it. I almost want to use it again, but I've been using the Cosmic Brushes one as much as I can. That's become like my new favorite palette, but Glaminatrix and Cosmic Brushes are like the only two new eyeshadow brands to me this year. And I'm so impressed with both of them that I use them over and over and over again. The Cosmic Brushes shimmers definitely do not transfer as much as the Glaminatrix ones, but these shimmers are so worth the transfer of them because they still look stunning at the end of the day that I don't really mind that. And I love that we have these two brownish, deeper toned mattes, so we get two options. So it's not boring with just one. And I just love like how most of these mattes go with the shimmers so well, like the greenish tone ones and the pinky tone ones. Like, that's really all you need, and you can create such beautiful looks with this palette. So I really love this one. And this one is their most sold palette, and it constantly sells out, and for good reason. It's a fantastic palette, and I totally understand why everyone loves this palette, because it's so freaking good. So definitely had to recommend that one. Okay, then this one, it might not be overly neutral when you first look at it, but I consider this a neutral palette with a twist to me, and that one is the Fall Magic palette by Unearthly Cosmetics. This is still my only Unearthly palette, because honestly this was the only one that was like the most versatile and the most interesting color story to me, but also a palette that I felt like I would use a lot, and I did use this a ton when I first got it. I just think this palette is so beautiful. But when you take out the two green shades and like the pops of purple, you mostly have a overall neutral toned palette. Now, I wouldn't say that the whole palette is neutral toned, but you have like these brown shades. You have three brown mattes, and then you have pinky purpley shades, like more mauve tone shades. And again, I consider pinks and mauve tones to be neutral. And this purple is just such a beautiful, like more toned down purpley shade. Okay, let's finish talking about this palette. Sorry, like usually this is the time where my family is going out of the house or my mom is coming home from work. So what makes this palette so beautiful is that there's these interesting like duochrome shimmers in here, and then like this deeper purple. but like the orange and the gold are like kind of more neutral leaning for me. But this palette is so beautiful. I love my looks every time I use this palette. You can do so many different color combos. Like I love pairing the greens and the purpley tones and the pinky tones together. Or I can just do a neutral look using these 3 shades and like one of these 2 on my lid, and it's just so gorgeous. So if there's like some neutral tones in a palette, I consider it a neutral palette with a twist, but it has to have like at least 7 or 8 shades that are like more neutral leaning. But this shade Earth is such a gorgeous duochrome. This shade Change is my favorite in the palette because it's like a beautiful, like shifting purpley pink shimmer, and it's so stunning. I also love the shade Autumn. It's a beautiful tangerine, but yeah, I could swatch this palette for forever, but the mattes are fantastic as well. Very blendable and easy to use and very pigmented, but they're just like so soft and velvety smooth. I'll swatch one of them for you, but they're just so pigmented. Oh my god, they're so good. I really am dying to use this palette again at some point as well. I'm going to try and use it maybe next month. I'm probably not going to get to it this month. I don't think I've even used this. I might have used it in the winter time. I really can't remember. But I did use it in the fall at least once or twice. So I don't know what that is. Okay. Next up is from another new brand to me that I tried last year, and that is Game Beauty. And this is the Victory palette. And again, this palette is mostly neutral toned, but it has like a couple of pops of color in here, but it is mostly a neutral palette. But it does have like these pops of blue in here. But basically, if you cover this one and this one, you get a neutral palette. But again, this palette is so wonderful formula-wise. The mattes just blend super easily, super buttery smooth, and the shimmers are just so stunning on the lid. These aren't my all-time favorite shimmers, but they're really pretty, but the matte formula is so smooth. This is kind of like my Naked Wild West to me. If I liked the formula in the Naked Wild West, it would probably be in this video. But I decluttered that like a while back. But I would say that this is just a stunning neutral palette with a twist because of the pops of blue. But again, the shimmers are really sparkly and beautiful. Some of them take a little bit more building than others, but they are really pretty on the lid. They have a lot more of like a sheer formula, but they're so pretty. And the mattes, again, are just so creamy and smooth. Look how pigmented that blue is. Like, are you joking? I would also like to use this palette a bit more at some point. I have used this palette enough, though, to say that I really like it. I've used like 3 of the shimmers twice. I think the only one I haven't used again is this shade, but I've used all 3 of these again, and they're all so freaking stunning. So I don't think I have a plastic insert for this one, no. And I love the packaging. Just Game Beauty is really like kicking ass right now. And I also didn't include any Nomad palettes in this video, which is kind of funny. But I like the Hudson Valley palette, but that would be the only one I would consider neutral. And that's not my favorite palette from Nomad. So I just wasn't going to include it. But it is a good palette. Okay, next up is Natasha Denona. And the first one is the Gold palette. Now, this palette is mostly neutral tone, but it does have a few pops of color in here to consider it being a neutral palette with a twist, because it has like all these beautiful shimmer finishes in here that are all like different finishes, but it has like these pops of blue and this like super lime green yellow shimmer that really, like, again, if you take like these 3 shades out of here, you're mostly left with a neutral palette. It's basically a neutral palette. This one is kind of more of like a silvery white, but y'all know I love this palette so much. This is like one of my prized possessions in my makeup collection. It's a fantastic formula. Never get tired of this palette. Even though there's only 6 mattes in here, the mattes just work so beautifully with all the shimmers, because this is one of those palettes like the Glaminatrix one that the mattes really like just show off how beautiful the shimmers are. So I had to mention this one as being one of my favorites, but again, these shimmers aren't really as saturated as they used to be. But this gold is my all-time favorite gold in my entire collection. The Mrs. Potts shade is very similar, but I really, really love like those super gold, like yellowy gold shimmers. And the mattes in here are wonderful. This is still my favorite Natasha Denona palette. It's just one that I really love. I just wish I would get more use out of it sometimes. I mean, I've used this so much. I just haven't really used it in the past few months, but I love it. I love this palette so much. I'll probably use this on like a special occasion at some point. The last 2 special occasions I went out for, I used the Dior palette and the Pat McGrath. I think I used maybe, and this one that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But yeah, love this palette. And then the most recent Natasha Denona palette to my collection and has quickly become one of my favorite Natasha Denona palettes, and that is the My Dream palette. This one is kind of a neutral palette with a twist, and this was like the only other one besides the next one I'm going to talk about that Karen Harris included as well. But I was like, yeah, this one is definitely a stunning neutral palette with a twist. Again, if you cover up these 3 shades, it's mostly a neutral palette, but we have this like beautiful berry purple, and then this deeper purple, and then we have the multi-chrome Vision. And it's such a stunning multi-chrome. I really want to use this shade again. This has been the only shade that I really haven't been able to use more than once. I only used it once on me and my boyfriend's anniversary back in December. Like that was the first time I used the palette, and that's the shade that I went with because I was dying to try the multi-chrome. But this palette is wonderful. The cream to matte formula is stunning as well. Again, these ones aren't going to swatch as great, but on the eyes, they are amazing. And the shimmers are just so multi-dimensional and beautiful in this palette. Like, they all have special, like, sparkly tones to them that just look so stunning on the eyes. And, I love like the depth and dimension that you can do with this palette, because you have a deep brown, you have a deep black, you have a deep purple, and then all of these mid-tone neutrals. They're just so pretty, and obviously they go with all the shades in this palette, but like I just think that this palette was one of the most well-curated Natasha Denona palettes that I've ever seen, and this palette is just so beautiful. And this has definitely become like tied with the gold palette to be like my favorite from Natasha Denona. I've used this enough to tell you guys how I feel about it. I would like to use it a bit more though, just so I can try all the shimmer shades twice, but I've used most of them twice. Only that Vision shade and the shade Serenity are the only 2 I haven't used again, but Serenity's a lot more of like a cooler tone matte, which I don't typically go for cooler tone mattes in the springtime. Okay, 2 more palettes. The next one is from Blend Bunny Cosmetics, and this is the All Done Up palette. This was one of my most used palettes this past winter. I just constantly went back to this palette, if I could hold it properly. I understand now what the hype is about Blend Bunny, and I just thought that this was the perfect format for me to try Blend Bunny, because I love that it was a 20 pan palette. I just thought like all of the palettes before this one were a little bit too big for me. 20 shades and under are usually like my sweet spot, like 16 pan, 15 pan, 12 pan, 9 pan. 20 pan are like pretty much like the biggest format that I'm going to go for before I start getting overwhelmed. But this palette is just so wonderfully laid out. But again, if you take out the green row, you're left with mostly a neutral palette. Like the green row really adds the interest to this palette, but These shimmer shades on the bottom are some of the best shimmers in my whole collection. Like, I would compare them to Glaminatrix shimmers. They are just as shiny and metallic and beautiful on the lids as Glaminatrix shadows are. And they're just super, super sparkly. Like, look at that shade. And the shade Shine, oh my god, this one is stunning as well. It's like a very light whitish green. It's so freaking gorgeous. It has amazing sparkles in it. And then the matte shades are just fantastic. Like, Blend Bunny mattes just blend out so easily. And I was just so impressed with the formula. But I just kept on going back to this palette over and over and over again in the winter time because it's just such a banging palette. And the only thing that I would change with this is that I didn't think we needed all of these like deeper tone browns. Like, almost these two, Doe-Eyed and Goddess, almost look exactly the same on the eyes. I'm not mad at them though because they're amazing, but like, we could have like changed up the tone just a tiny bit, but at the same time, I like that they're deep and dark because that adds all the depth and dimension that I need. So, and I love the row of lighter tone mattes as well, and then the mid-tone row. Just such a beautiful palette. This palette is fantastic, and this is like probably the only holiday release that is such a good, well thought out palette that you can use year round. But honestly, this is more so like a fall winter neutral palette for me because again, it's a lot more cooler toned. But you can get some really beautiful warm looks out of it too, but it's more so a winter palette for me. And then the last one is the Moira Always On My Mind palette from the Sweet Series collection. There was like a collection of 4 palettes. This palette and this brand is very underrated. But I actually just whipped out this palette a couple of days ago and I hadn't used it in a while. And I would consider this a neutral palette with a twist because, again, it is mostly, I'm going to say that so many times. It is mostly neutral toned, but it's not the pops of shimmer that we are talking about in this palette. It's more so the pops of color with the mattes. Like, we have this pop of yellow, we have this pop of like orangey pinkish almost, and then we have like this reddish color, and then we have this purpley color. And Moira's matte formula is just so super smooth and pigmented and saturated, and then the shimmers are just so stunning. I've said this time and time again, but this yellow is so good. Like, look how pigmented that is. Yellow is so hard to formulate, and so is purple, and this purple is fantastic too. Like, look at that pigmentation. Are you joking? And then the shimmers are so stunning. I love the shade Me and You, but I think it's gotten some hard pan. Yeah, that's definitely my fault, but it's really stunning. You can still see how pretty it is. It's definitely more saturated when I put it on my lid. Like, it still works, but I love that also, like, with this palette, I don't really have to dip into any other palette because there's a light brow bone highlight here. So those are some of my favorite palettes as well. But this palette is so pretty, and I try to use it when I can as well. And I'm just so happy I was able to use it a couple of days ago. I was going to put it in my spring rotation, but I'm glad I just used it anyway. So it ended up being in my spring rotation. It was in my spring rotation last year, but then I also wanted to use it this year, even though it wasn't in my spring palettes video this year. All right, so that is it, you guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe. Follow me on my Instagram at CBW819 and check out my Poshmark at the same handle. And let me know if you guys have tried any of these palettes or any of these palettes, some of your favorites. Let me know, and I hope you all have a great day. Bye.